Yeah, so right now, about 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death worldwide are largely preventable. Number one, across the board, heart disease. In the US and literally every country throughout the world, heart disease is the number one killer. A close second would be stroke and other sort of brain illnesses, everything from Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's. And then cancer is usually number three, 3 or 4, depending on what country you're in. Diabetes is in the top 10 and its complications. And usually we're speaking of type 2 diabetes, which is basically nearly 100% preventable. Type 1 diabetes is actually quite rare. And actually the latest statistic I just saw was either, 50% of the US either has diabetes type 2 or pre-diabetes. In other words, they have insulin resistance and elevated fasting blood sugar. 1 out of 2 people in the US. So those are the ones. There's also kidney disease. Most of that's preventable. That's in the top 10. Most lung disease, that's a top killer. Most lung disease is also preventable. So I think I've named about 7 already. But yeah, it's overwhelming that most of these illnesses that are number one killers worldwide are nearly entirely preventable. There's obviously some genetic, element there. But what we've learned in the last, I would say, decade is that the other layer called epigenetics, which is basically all of the other things besides what's in your DNA. It's what you do every day, what you don't do every day, what you eat, what you don't eat, if you move your body, if you don't move your body, what you're exposed to. There's so many toxins out there in the environment now. And so all of these other things play into whether or not the genes that we actually have get turned on or turned off. And so that's the whole epigenetic phenomenon. And that's responsible for about 90 some odd percent of our illness. And only about 10% or less is actually from the DNA we were given by our parents. So it's actually largely under our control, which I find super empowering.
So this is a topic that I think is widely misunderstood, and it's an extremely important one, because in sort of mainstream media, and I think within conventional medicine, there is often an attitude of, oh, it's genetic. Oh, you have the obesity gene. You have heart disease runs in my family. Oh, diabetes runs in my family. Cancer runs in my family. Oh, do you have the breast cancer gene? Then you got to cut your breasts off, right? There is often, very frequently in our culture, in this particular time in history, there is still very much an attitude of genetics equal one's destiny. And what you just said is that 90%, as a generalization, 90% of the disease that we're experiencing is generally through non-genetic factors. So how would you explain to someone who is maybe coming from that sort of paradigm of, oh, diabetes runs in my family. Oh, do you have the breast cancer gene? Oh, that means you're going to get breast cancer. How would you explain to them, how would you talk them out of that sort of paradigm?
Yeah, so the cool thing is nowadays there's actually data to prove this. In fact, some people would say even more extreme, that 95, 96, 98% of what illness we come down with is actually what is not on the gene. So the genes, our genetic material, our DNA, obviously we get from our parents, right? But whether or not those genes get turned on or turned off, and we can actually study this. There's processes that turn on and off. This is called regulation of genes through processes such as methylation, for example. That's one that some people have heard of, because I think the common sort of health, folks that are out there talk a lot about methylation. They talk about MTHFR. They talk about these kinds of things, which are important, but it's an oversimplification. So there's a lot of processes in the body that get to decide ultimately if the genes we possess actually get turned on or turned off. And most of that has to do with the things that we do each and every day and the things that we don't do. And we actually have data to back this up. And so what I would tell people is that was kind of the old school. That's even how I was trained back. I was trained in the 90s in medical school, and your genes were sort of like, something that inarguably that was kind of like the biggest factor back in those days when we looked at sort of the pathophysiology of disease. We always focused on is there a genetic component to this? And I get that because that's what we saw at the time. That's what we assumed. Since I left medical school, we've been able to, many times over, been able to actually see what the genetic material in the code, the human genome, right? That's been done, right? It's been done now for a decade. And so we actually have all of those genes. And yet when we look at the diseases that are out there, yes, there is some play of the genetics, but most of it is actually in actual practice in the actual folks out there, most of it is actually not due to the disease. So here's an example. So say, I have a patient that has the BRCA gene, which is the one that gives you the susceptibility to breast cancer. And I have another patient that also has that. One of them develops breast cancer, one of them does not. They have the exact same gene. And what is not usually the same is all the other things that happen in their life, whether or not they're doing certain lifestyle practices, whether they're having good solid 8 hours of sleep a night, whether their stress is under control, whether they're eating, real foods rather than the stuff that comes in a package with 50 ingredients. These are the things that really make the difference in the end. It's not just what's in your DNA. And so I believe, and I take the approach, it's very empowering to know that you can't just blame your genetic material. You can't just blame your parents for everything. Maybe it's 10%, but many people would say it's actually less than that. If you talk to Bruce Lipton, he'll tell you it's 1%. 1% of actually what your health looks like comes from your DNA, and the other 99% comes from the stuff that you do and the stuff that you don't do. So I personally feel like that's very empowering. And the cool thing is we actually have data to back that up nowadays. Whereas when I was in school, that wasn't the case. And I don't believe we even had the word epigenetics in the vernacular back in the 90s. I certainly never heard of it.
Yeah, we didn't. I remember Bruce Lipton's book was one of the first books that came out talking about it. I think the main criticism of Bruce Lipton's work that I would have, I think he was, I don't want to detract from all of his contributions, because I think he's made a monumental contribution, especially at that early phase when the idea of epigenetics was really revolutionary. He made this contribution of saying, hey, it's not the nucleus in your DNA that's dictating your destiny. It's the instructions to the DNA, the signaling that goes into the nucleus. And I think the mistake he made, from my perspective, is to reduce all of that down to the psychological, the emotional, what's going on mentally, right? He made it about what you believe and what's going on at a psychological level. And there are a lot of followers of his work that I've seen who take that paradigm, and in my opinion, they extend it way too far. And there's an enormous misunderstanding there, which is these people say, oh, it's what my genes do is a function of what I believe. And so if I think positively and I have a positive mindset, then that's epigenetics. That's influencing how my genes express. And I'm like, well, that's a piece of it, but also how you eat and how you move and your light exposure habits and your thermal exposure habits and your sleep and your circadian rhythm and environmental toxicants and all these other different layers of inputs also have a massive impact on the expression of your genes. So it's a mistake, a very big mistake, in my opinion, to reduce the entirety of epigenetics down to the purely psychological realm.
Yeah, well put, Ari. I have exactly that same understanding myself, is that it's just one of those factors. And I think the oversimplification that you mentioned with just what your mind and your mental space tells your genes, it's definitely important, but there's so many other pieces to that puzzle. And I'm completely with you that the whole environment, the milieu, as we call it, in the sciences, incorporates that as one component. And then all the other things you mentioned are equally important. I couldn't agree more.
Hey, this is Ari. I hope you enjoyed this little clip. And if you want to listen to the full-length podcast, the link for that is down in the description below. Also, one more thing before you go, I want to mention, in case you don't already know about it, our formula, Energenesis. This is an amazing product. that has multiple compounds in it that are scientifically proven in numerous studies to increase your energy levels, not just by 3% or 5% or 10%, but by 30 or 40 or 50% in a very, very short time frame. So one of these compounds that I'll mention here is called NT factor phospholipid, and it is an extract of phospholipids that comes from lecithin, and they extract the pure phospholipids from this, things like phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethanolamine, and many others. And these are the same fatty acid compounds, phospholipid compounds, that compose our cell membranes and mitochondrial membranes. And this specific patented formula has been shown actually to enter into the bloodstream undigested, basically, without being broken down and denatured through the digestive process in the stomach and the intestines. It makes it into the bloodstream and actually makes it all the way to our cells and to our mitochondria, where it helps repair damaged mitochondrial membranes and facilitates our mitochondria functioning better. Now, all of that sounds like wonderful theory, and it sounds like it could be beneficial, but the real test is, has it actually been studied and been proven to increase your energy levels? And the answer is yes, absolutely. There are numerous studies outlined in a wonderful paper by a scientist named Garth Nicholson, in a paper called Lipid Replacement Therapy. I highly recommend checking this out if you're interested in digging into the research. But this compound has been studied in the context of multiple different kinds of chronic fatigue. Aging-related chronic fatigue, obesity-related chronic fatigue, obscure things like Gulf War illness, and numerous studies in chronic fatigue syndrome. And there are studies showing that this has the capability. They've taken one study, in fact, actually showed that in elderly adults over the age of 65, it restored their mitochondrial health, which had deteriorated heavily. It restored it to the level of healthy 29-year-olds, believe it or not. And they've actually measured energy levels in these people. And all of these studies across the board show improvements in energy of at least 25%, and typically more like 35 to 45% in just the span of between 4 to 12 weeks. That's how long all of these studies are, 4 to 12 weeks. They're showing dramatic, huge improvements in energy levels by helping to repair these mitochondrial membranes through this thing called lipid replacement therapy, using, again, this patented form of a phospholipid extract called NT factor. This is just one of about 20 ingredients proven to benefit mitochondrial health that you'll find in my formula Energenesis. So I strongly encourage you, if you are struggling with your energy levels, if you're dealing with chronic fatigue, go grab yourself a bottle or 3 of this, or subscribe and save. Try it out. You are going to be blown away by the results. We get so many testimonials. We get so many emails from people talking about how this one thing has transformed their lives. So I cannot encourage you strongly enough to give this a shot. And let's say you buy 3 bottles, try out the first one, give it a month. And if you don't notice significant improvements, you can return the unopened bottles to us for a full refund. So give it a shot. I really think you're going to be blown away by the results. The formula is called Energenesis, and you can get it at theenergyblueprint.com or click the link below. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you again very soon.